Eleanor Graves ripped the white wreath from the funeral altar and threw it straight onto the tiled floor. "Get this garbage out of my neighborhood before I call the police to disperse all of you." Her spittle landed on the portrait of the deceased, which was solemnly placed on the podium. The ebony coffin shook as Eleanor knocked over a vase of white lilies, their shattered petals falling onto the cold floor. "You think you can turn this decent neighborhood into a public nuisance? Not on my watch." Her voice hissed, bitter and contemptuous. 50 funeral attendees sat stunned, their sobs caught in their throats, their red-rimmed eyes turned towards the podium, filled with a mix of indignation and helplessness. No one could believe such a painful scene was being torn apart by such cruel insults. The funeral atmosphere, which had only known prayers and muffled cries, was now thick with shameful silence, a heavy weight on each person's chest. 2 patrol cars slowly drove down Maple Ridge Road, their red and blue lights sweeping across the neatly trimmed lawns. A murmur arose. The funeral guests all turned their heads. A glass in a middle-aged woman's hand froze in midair. The violinist stopped playing, and the music faded. "Ma'am, where's the disturbance?" a police officer asked, his eyes sweeping across the scene filled with wreaths, pristine white chairs, and faces immersed in grief. Eleanor lunged forward, her trembling finger pointing directly at the group of people dressed in black. "There! It's them, drinking, causing a public disturbance. I already reported it." The police officer frowned. In front of him, a few children huddled beside the coffin. An elderly man dabbed away tears with a handkerchief. The chaos Eleanor was screaming about was just the silent pain of people in mourning. The whole room fell silent. Every eye was on Eleanor, the late afternoon sun shining directly on her face, exposing her unconcealed, irrational hatred. After a moment of silence, the officer turned to Eleanor. "Are you sure? This is a funeral." That calm voice was like a knife cutting through the thick air. A woman burst into loud sobs, her broken cry making the room tremble. Eleanor was speechless, her lips moving as she searched for words. She only saw dozens of bloodshot eyes looking at her, filled with resentment and hurt. A frail old man stood up with his cane, his voice hoarse. "My son is in that coffin. Is this a disturbance?" The police officer slowly nodded, as if confirming the obvious truth. In that moment, the power Eleanor had tried to cling to, her threats, her frantic phone call, dissolved, leaving a bitter void. Outside, the church bells tolled a somber rhythm. That sound was not only to bid farewell to the deceased, but also like a heavy judgment falling upon Eleanor Whitmore's shoulders. The funeral space was still heavy with Eleanor's curses. The white shroud on the coffin was covered with broken petals. In the corner of the room, a Kaite, little girl sobbed, her face stained with tears, her small hand clutching a half-torn paper wreath. Her cry rang out like a knife slicing through the air. The tall police officer stopped short. He looked around the room, then at Eleanor with a mix of doubt and disappointment. His colleague next to him cleared his throat softly. "I don't see any alcohol or drugs. I only see a very normal funeral." Eleanor's eyes widened, her voice wavering. "Are you both blind? Look, they've taken over the funeral home, gathering to eat, drink, and cry. If that's not chaos, what is?" A guest, a middle-aged man in a black suit, suddenly stood up. His face was flushed, his voice trembling but firm. "That's enough, Mrs. Whitmore. This is my brother's funeral. We are saying goodbye to our last family member. Who do you think you are to trample on a family's pain?" That sound was like a spark igniting a pile of ashes. A murmur rose throughout the room. A few others also stood up, their gazes filled with indignation directed at Eleanor. An old woman with a cane and a hunched back walked forward step by step. Her voice was weak, but each word resonated through the heavy atmosphere. "My husband is in that coffin. He lived a decent life and never harmed anyone. Yet on his last day, his soul is being smeared by your vicious words. Eleanor, you have no humanity left." The entire room fell completely silent. The wind whistling through the cracks in the door sounded like a cold whisper. The eyes of the mourners were all on Eleanor, no longer fearful of her aggression, but filled with contempt and resentment. Eleanor took a step back, her face contorting. She turned to the police for help. See? They're defying me. They're aggressive. You have to do something. But the police officer just crossed his arms and sighed. Mrs. Whitmore, we came here because you reported an illegal gathering and a disturbance. But this is clearly a legal funeral, with all the necessary permits. If you continue to cause a scene, you will be the one who has to leave. The murmuring in the crowd turned into decisive nods. A few people even started to take out their phones to record the entire scene. The cold blue LED lights flashed, reflecting on Eleanor's face, which was distorted with anger. You've all been bribed by them. You'll regret this, she yelled, her voice hoarse. This is my neighborhood, a place for decent people. I won't let you turn it into a slum. Her scream echoed, but no one was moved. Instead, a few sobs broke out from the back rows. A little boy hugged his mother tightly, asking in a trembling whisper, Mom, why does she hate us so much? The mother just held her son tighter to her chest, not answering, tears streaming down her haggard face. Eleanor suddenly realized she had just revealed the rawest truth in her heart, an unconcealed hatred and prejudice. And now it was being witnessed by dozens of eyes, recorded on dozens of phones. The police officer stepped forward, his voice stern. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, we are asking you to leave this funeral immediately. If you do not comply, we will be forced to use coercive measures. The air was so tense it felt like it would shatter. Eleanor froze, her whole body trembling. She glanced around, but could no longer find a single supportive gaze. The people who used to greet her and smile on the street were now standing against her. Finally, Eleanor spun around, her heels clacking on the cold tiled floor. The funeral home door swung open, and the late afternoon light streamed in, illuminating her small, solitary figure from behind. In that moment, everyone understood. The mask Eleanor had worn for years in this upscale neighborhood had fallen, revealing her true face, distorted and full of resentment. When the door closed, the funeral was enveloped in a silence so profound that you could hear people's hearts pounding. Then the violin began to play again, trembling but strong, as if to affirm that the evil of the world could not overshadow human pain and kindness. In the corner of the room, the police officer shook his head softly, sighed and muttered, Some of the worst things in the world don't come from criminals but from the human heart. And so, Eleanor's downfall began not with a verdict, but with the contemptuous gaze of the entire community. Beyond that door, Eleanor stood isolated on the gray-tiled patio. No eyes followed her, no voice spoke, no word of justification. There was only the sound of the wind whistling softly through the rows of maple trees, carrying the faint scent of funeral flowers from inside. She gripped her iPhone tightly in her hand, the screen still brightly lit from the recent call. Her fingers trembled, and cold sweat soaked her palm. A single question echoed in Eleanor's mind. How could the whole world have turned its back on me so quickly? Her high heels made a hollow, lonely sound on the pavement as she backed away. Through the frosted glass, the mourners didn't bother to look out. They had returned to their real grief, leaving Eleanor's burning anger to consume her. Hypocrites, she mumbled, her lips tightly pressed together. You won't get rid of me that easily. But her voice was trembling, lacking conviction. It echoed in the empty courtyard, more as a self-reassurance than a threat. Eleanor turned and walked away. The familiar Maple Ridge Road leading to her house suddenly felt long and endless. The white fences and flower beds in front of the houses, once so familiar, now looked like pairs of eyes staring, cold and judgmental. Meanwhile, inside the funeral home, the atmosphere gradually stabilized. The sounds of prayer were steady, and the somber music bid farewell to the departed soul. But beneath that silence, another current was forming, the current of solidarity. A young man stood up, his voice trembling but resolute. We cannot let this happen again. No funeral, no gathering in this community deserves to be subjected to such an insult. All eyes turned to him. The faces, haggard from loss, now held another glint of light, determination. The funeral director nodded softly. Yes, We will not let one individual use hatred to break our solidarity. The person who passed away today deserves to be sent off in peace, and future generations also deserve to live in peace." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. The people who had been silent moments ago were now finding their voices. A young woman wiped away tears, speaking softly but clearly. "She didn't just insult the deceased. She insulted all of us." That statement was like a flame igniting a pile of embers. The whole room was filled with a new energy. Grief turned into unity, and hurt transformed into a silent vow. Outside, Eleanor stood frozen on her doorstep. The porch light was on, casting light on her pale face. She clutched her keys, but her hand trembled too much to put them in the lock. For a moment, she felt as if she had been truly expelled from what was once her safe territory. No one was listening anymore. No one was defending her. Only darkness was closing in on her from all sides. A silent fear stirred within her, but Eleanor refused to acknowledge it. She whispered to herself, "They are all wrong. Only I am right." Her voice echoed in the empty porch, sounding like a distant, isolated murmur. In the funeral room, after a moment of calm, people began to stand up. The pain of loss was still there, but their voices rang out more clearly than ever. An elderly woman with gray hair and a cane, her eyes red, pointed to the door Eleanor had just left. "A person like that doesn't deserve to be here. We have spent our whole lives trying to build compassion, and yet she dared to bring her bitterness to trample on this pain." A young man followed, his voice firm. "Not just today. She has sown her venomous words into this community many times. We have been silent for too long." The murmuring blended into a chorus of agreement. Everyone turned to each other, nodding. It was no longer individual indignation. It was a symphony of defiance. The funeral director stood up, banging his cane on the floor. "We must leave a clear message. No one has the right to bring resentment and contempt to this sacred place, and no one has the right to break the solidarity that generations have preserved." The room rang with cheers. "Yes, we have to speak up. We can't be silent anymore." A woman holding her small child in her arms burst into tears. "I don't want my child to grow up in a town where cruelty is tolerated." Those words, one by one, piled up like waves. No one was shouting, but the determination in their voices made the small room feel as if it were trembling. Outside, through the frosted glass, Eleanor was still lurking, as if she wanted to return. But each word echoing from within struck her ears directly. Her once proud face was now crumpled, her lips pressed tightly together as if trying to swallow something choked. Finally, the door slammed shut, an insurmountable barrier. The people at the funeral bowed their heads in prayer again, but this time, in that silence, there was not only a farewell to the deceased, but also a pledge. This community would never accept cruelty cloaked in authority. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, illuminating Eleanor's cold house. She sat motionless on the sofa, her deep-set eyes staring at her phone screen. On it, short videos of her being asked to leave the funeral had spread at lightning speed. The sorrowful faces, the tears, and the community's indignant voices were all clearly audible. People were not only witnessing the scene, but also sharing, discussing, and condemning it. "I can't believe someone would do that at a funeral. Such a terrible insult. We have to stand with the family. No one can show such disregard for human kindness." Hundreds, then thousands of comments scrolled up like waves, relentless, without a single gap. No one was defending her. No one was finding excuses. Eleanor tried to turn off the screen, but the sound of indignation still echoed in her ears. Every notification was a new stab. Outside, the once peaceful small town was now buzzing with conversations. At the coffee shop, the market, and the street corner, everyone was talking about Eleanor. But it was no longer with deference or social nods. Instead, it was with looks of anger and open disgust. "I was there yesterday. I've never seen the whole town so united." Exactly, she brought it on herself. This is no longer just a private matter for the grieving family. It's a matter for all of us. That afternoon in front of Eleanor's house, a few hastily written notes were left by someone. "We choose compassion, not hatred. Leave. Don't come back." The wind blew the papers around, their rustling sound like a silent verdict. Inside the house, Eleanor sat in silence. For the first time in many years, she clearly felt what it was like to be isolated, not just from a funeral, but from the very community that had once tolerated her. Outside, social media was still raging, and inside, the silence grew thicker, as if swallowing her whole. Eleanor clutched her phone, but this time, no one was on the other end of the line to listen to her anymore. Eleanor sat in the dark, with only the blue light from her phone screen reflecting on her face. The criticisms were overwhelming, endless, like a sea of people surrounding her from all directions. For a moment, her eyes turned red, and her hands gripped the phone so tightly they trembled. A deep part of her heart whispered, "Maybe I went too far. Maybe I was really wrong." But immediately, another voice in her head screamed, "No! They're just exaggerating. I am stronger than all of them. This will all pass." And so, Eleanor was caught between two shores, a vague remorse and a blind pride. She neither admitted her mistake nor let go. She just sat motionless, letting the community's invisible knocks on her door echo in her mind. Will she truly awaken, or will she continue to delude herself until she is swept away? Please click follow in the top right corner to watch the final conclusion. The moment the funeral home door closed was also the moment the story's ripple effect began to spread. People left the funeral with heavy steps, but instead of just carrying sadness, they also carried a strange impulse, the need to speak up. Along Maple Ridge Road, elderly people whispered, parents bent down to talk to their children, and young couples exchanged thoughtful glances. No one mentioned Eleanor's disruption much anymore, but her name was like a festering wound, forcing everyone to look at themselves and their community. A middle-aged woman held her small daughter's hand and said slowly, "See, just one cruel word can hurt so many people. When you grow up, never let your words cause such pain to anyone." The child nodded, her clear eyes looking up at her mother, as if she had learned a lesson that books had never taught. Meanwhile, in a nearby street corner, a few men gathered around an old wooden table, their voices agitated but also determined. "We can't just let this fade away. If we do, there will be other times. Other people who bring hatred to a place meant for peace." Right. At the very least, we have to make our stance clear. This community will never tolerate such an insult. That conversation quickly drew in more people. From a few individuals, it became a small group, and gradually the entire town seemed to be caught in a new current, the current of reaction. But this reaction was not with retaliation, not with counter-venomous words. The people of Maple Ridge understood that fighting hatred with hatred only deepens the wound. Instead, they chose to express solidarity. The next day, walking past the market, you could see small notes pinned to the notice board. "Respect to live in peace together." In front of the school, the principal wrote on the blackboard, "Words can heal, but they can also hurt. Choose kind words." Young people use their phones to write down their thoughts, share their feelings, and call on their friends to be more compassionate. They didn't just talk about Eleanor, but about themselves, about the times they had accidentally let their words become weapons. These simple but heartfelt messages spread, making many people read them in silence and nod in contemplation. One afternoon in the Central Park, a group of teenagers organized a small gathering. They brought guitars and some handwritten signs with messages like, "Use words to build, not to destroy," and "Respect is the foundation of a community." The music played in the grassy area, simple and unplanned, but filled with the spirit of wanting to heal. Passers-by stopped, some smiled, some shed tears, and then they sang and felt it together. Gradually, the incident at the funeral was no longer just a source of pain or a stain, but a milestone, a reminder that the whole community would remember. People no longer just asked, "Why did she say that?" but began to ask themselves, "What will we do so that no one else has to endure that again?" An old man who had been silent at the funeral now slowly confided in his neighbor, "That day I sat still and didn't dare to say anything. Now that I think about it, I regret it a lot. But perhaps the important thing is that from now on, I will never be silent in the face of an insult again." His words made everyone who heard him fall silent. Everyone saw a reflection of themselves in his words, because many people that day had chosen to look away, hoping the incident would pass quickly. But now they understood that silence could also be an accomplice to wrong. And it was that collective remorse that became the glue that bound everyone together. The Maple Ridge community did not hold a big meeting, nor did they need flashy posters. They quietly but persistently changed every word and every action in their daily lives. They reminded their children, comforted each other, and encouraged each other to live more kindly. And by doing so, they turned a wound into an opportunity to heal, and a painful moment into the strength to move forward. Some said, Eleanor left a scratch on the community, but many others replied, no, we are the ones who decide whether that scratch becomes a bad scar or a valuable lesson. Since then, Maple Ridge seems to have become more peaceful, not because there are no longer conflicts, but because people know how to look at each other with more tolerance, to be more careful with their words, and most importantly, to know that unity is true strength. And so what happened on the day of the funeral went beyond a single incident. It became a story to remind people everywhere. Never underestimate the power of a single word, and never underestimate the strength of a community when they stand up to protect kindness. In front of Eleanor's house, a small sign appeared. No one knew who placed it. We choose compassion, not hatred. Eleanor stood and looked at the words for a long time. Her heart was heavy, not with the familiar anger, but with a loneliness she had never known. No one came to talk to her anymore. No more smiles of greeting each morning. She understood that the community had chosen to turn their backs on her, but not for revenge, but to preserve the peace they cherished. A few weeks later, Eleanor quietly left Maple Ridge. Her old house closed its doors, leaving a void in the hearts of those who remained, but also a sense of relief. The funeral that day, which she had tried to disrupt, ultimately became a turning point that brought the entire community together. They had learned to protect each other, not to remain silent in the face of resentment and prejudice. The story of Eleanor eventually faded, but it still lingered as a quiet warning that hatred can destroy a person's life, but it can never defeat kindness. That prejudice not only hurts others, but also makes the person who holds it the most isolated. And that every small action of ours, a look, a word, a gesture, contributes to the identity of the entire community. Choose compassion. Choose respect. Because only then can we truly call the place we live home. Sometimes just one prejudiced word can hurt an entire community, but it is also in those moments that human unity and kindness shine more brightly than ever. The story in Maple Ridge is not only a reminder of the consequences of hatred, but also proof that as long as we stand together, all darkness will be pushed back. What about you? If you were at that funeral, would you choose to remain silent, or would you stand up to defend what is right? Feel free to share your thoughts, and don't forget to follow the channel for more human and profound stories.